Hi YouTube, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and I'm here today to respond to some questions that I got recently on my Instagram account about children and eating food. So I thought that I would have another little pantry chat here and kind of talk about what works for our family. If you don't follow us on Instagram, there are a few things that maybe you need to know about us to put things in context when I'm talking about our family and getting children to eat. First is my oldest son, Gabriel, has anaphylactic food allergies to both peanuts and dairy, and he's had these since birth. He had his first anaphylactic reaction to dairy when he was less than 2 months old. So we've always had these food challenges, and he is our oldest child. So that has really sort of set a pattern for how we deal with food in our house with him being our oldest. We've never been able to eat at restaurants as a family or order fast food, order pizza, things like that. Most processed foods, even convenience foods at the grocery store, are simply out of the question because the risk of cross-contamination with his allergies is so high. He has very, very bad allergies. So basically, everything that we eat in our house is made from whole food ingredients, made from scratch by me or someone else in the family, and that's pretty much what we do. My children have had fast food and restaurant food before, everybody except for Gabriel, so they are aware that those options exist out there, but it isn't a regular part of our diet, and so I think that is something to remember. My kids are really good eaters when it comes to what I cook here at home, simply because they don't really have other options. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing that you may not know about us, if you don't follow us on Instagram, is every year I tend to do a pantry challenge in the winter. We work very hard all spring, summer, and fall to grow our own food, to preserve as much as we can, and then we try to avoid going to the grocery store during the months of January and February. We just eat off of all of that food that we've worked so hard for. And then I post our daily meals on my Instagram account during that entire 2-month period. Every breakfast, lunch, and dinner is posted. And so a lot of the questions that I get around food and my children are generated because people see the meals I'm posting and they're like, "Do you really get your children to eat that?" Because toward the end of the pantry challenge, things are getting a little boring. We haven't been to the grocery store in 2 months, where we kind of are getting creative with what we're eating. But yes, my response is always, my children do eat that. And so I want to, in today's video, to kind of talk to you about why my children eat what is served, and how maybe you can implement some strategies in your own house to get your picky toddlers or your picky older children to eat more of the home-cooked food that you've worked so hard to prepare for them. Another food challenge that's a really important part of how we view food here in our household has to do with me. I struggled with Crohn's disease for most of my adult life and through the beginning of my parenting journey. And it wasn't until maybe I had my 4th child that I started focusing more on diet and healing my own body through diet. And the children, especially the older children, have watched me on that journey. They watched me go from being very sick to getting extremely healthy using food. And we talk a lot about food in that context in our home, that food is medicine, that food is about nutrients, and that yes, food is pleasure and we want our food to taste good and we want to have fun with the meals that we have, but primarily food is about getting the nutrients that you need. And my children will talk about food in that way. They'll look at their plate and say, "Hey mom, I need a little more protein," or "Mom, I haven't had any calcium today, can you fix me something with calcium?" And that may sound strange, but that's just the way things work in our house. And I think when kids have that idea of food, that this is fuel for your body, that these are nutrients that your body needs to be healthy, that's a great way to get them to eat things that maybe aren't the tastiest, but that they know are good for them. And so when your children are young, it's very important to teach them what food does, what nutrients are in the food they eat, that they need protein and carbohydrates, and they need vitamins and minerals, and that all of that should be on their plate, and all of that is important in their diet. And so that has really served our family well, watching my healing journey combined with Gabriel's food allergy challenges.
I make my house chicken with blue on. You okay? You okay?
My first tip for getting picky toddlers to eat, picky children in general, would be to set realistic expectations for your children when it comes to food and portions, especially. The average American has no idea what real portions should be, what healthy portions are, because most restaurants serve huge portions, and this is, not healthy for us. So a lot of times we look at portions that are served to adults and we just kind of downsize it a little bit and give it to our children, not realizing that we're probably giving them normal adult-sized portions, and we may be eating way more than we should be. And this lesson was really hit home for me when Gabriel was little. He was about 2 years old, and my doctor referred me to a pediatric nutritionist because they were worried that he may not be getting all of the nutrients he needed with his dietary restrictions. At the time, he had a laundry list of allergies. It wasn't just dairy and peanuts. He had outgrown several of those by the time he was school age. But when he was 2, he was very restricted in what he could eat. So we went to this pediatric nutritionist, and they evaluated a food journal to just make sure he was getting everything. And I remember in these talks with the nutritionist seeing what real portions looked like for a 2-year-old. A portion of protein for a meal was maybe the size of 1 chicken nugget. That's not a lot of meat, whereas we may fill a toddler's plate with 4 chicken nuggets or a whole half a chicken breast cut up and expect them to eat all of that, when that is way more than their stomach really needs or possibly could even handle. And so it's not fair to get upset with that toddler for not finishing everything on their plate when we gave them too much to begin with. So realistic expectations around how much food a toddler actually needs is key. And then when you fill their plate for a meal, start small. They can always go back and get seconds if they really like something. But you're just setting yourself up for failure if you give them these huge portions that they're just physically unable to eat. Children are very good at listening to their bodies. Adults tend to eat more for pleasure, and we will overeat because something tastes so good. But in my experience, kids are much better at listening to their bodies. And so once they're full and they've had enough, they tend to stop. And so if they haven't finished everything on their plate, you may need to look at, maybe I gave them too much to begin with. Something that goes along with having realistic expectations when it comes to portion sizes, I think, is also allowing children to have a little bit of control over the portions that are put on their plate. What works really well for us is laying out all of the food options for the meal on the kitchen island. And then I stand on the other side with my plates and my scoops, and the kids kind of come up one at a time and we go down the line. Okay, do you want this? Yes. So I'll put a little scoop on, and then they may say, can I have a little more? Oh, yes, wonderful. And I'll scoop a little more, and we'll go down the line and fill their plate that way. And then, the expectation is that if you asked for that food, then you should eat it. It would be wasteful to ask for a second scoop and then leave some of that on the plate. So there is that expectation with the children that whatever portions you asked for, you are expected to eat, because you did have the option not to put that on your plate at all while we were filling your plate. So that works really well for us, especially with toddlers, I find. Not young toddlers. There is a developmental period with 2-year-olds especially, where they're learning to exert their own control and their bodily autonomy and things like that, where it may be very normal for them just to refuse to eat something because that's the age that they are. But once you start getting into age 3, 4, the pickiness might be more just them figuring out what their preferences are with food. And so I find it especially helpful with my 4-year-old right now to really let him determine what goes on his plate. And when he determines it, he generally eats what is there. Do you like the chicken salad?
Yeah.
Do you want more? Do you want some more?
I want some of that.
Some of what?
I saw you.
Some olives?
Yeah.
Okay, sit down. Start eating your eggs you asked for. I'll get you olives. I feel like this might be a common theme in some of these mothering chats that I have. But if we need to have the same expectations for our children that we have for ourselves. So sometimes we need to look at the behavior we're modeling when it comes to food. If you're someone who's a picky eater, who doesn't eat a lot of vegetables, you're filling your plate and your children see that your vegetable portions are very small and you don't enjoy eating those foods. Maybe you make faces when there's something on your plate that you don't like. You know, that behavior is definitely going to be transferred over to their children and affect their attitudes when it comes to food. But if you're someone who's very adventurous with food and you're willing to try things and you have this attitude of, oh, this is so fun, let's try this new thing, you know, your children are going to be much more likely to adopt that attitude with their food as well. So that's something really important to remember is the children are always watching and they learn much more by what they see than what we say. So be the parent that's adventurous with food, that finishes everything on your own plate, and the children are more likely to do that as well. Okay, David, do you want chicken salad or sun butter?
Some butter.
Sun butter. Okay. Do you want it in a sandwich or do you want it?
Sandwich. Some butter and jelly.
Sun butter and jelly. Thank you. The rule in our house when it comes to meals is that you don't have to finish your plate if you're not hungry, or you don't have to eat what's served if you have an aversion to that food. But you know, mom isn't a short order cook, so I'm not going to make you other options. When I first started out parenting my older boys, I had a much different attitude when it came to food with them. I remember being very strict. They had to finish everything on their plate, and there was tears and frustration and just I would, if they didn't finish it at dinner, I would put it in the fridge, and the next morning it would come out at breakfast. This is how it's going to be, and they're going to be obedient and eat their food. You know, and something clicked maybe by the time I had my third child, and I sort of loosened up on the rules, and that tends to happen with us as parents. The older children unfortunately bear the brunt of our idealism when we set out as parents, and you soften and learn as you realize what's a little more realistic for children. But by the time I had my third, I remember it clicking with me. You know, no one forces me to eat my food when I'm not hungry, nor would I want to, if I'm not hungry, eat everything on my plate. And also, no one forces me to eat things that I have an aversion to. You know, that isn't fair. If someone cooked something that I don't like and then I had to force me to sit there and eat it all, I mean, that isn't something that happens to me as an adult. So why am I expecting this out of my children? And so that's how this rule sort of morphed in our house to, you don't have to eat it. That's fine. I don't want to have the fight over the food, but you're not going to get other options. So you either eat it or you're hungry, and there are no other choices. And that has served us well. Hungry children will eat. Barring any, you know, sensory processing issues or other things, you know, that have to do with texture and food and things like that. But if children are genuinely hungry, they're going to eat what's put in front of them. So I don't worry about my children starving if I make a meal that they don't like and they don't eat. I don't have to provide another option, because if they were truly hungry, they would eat what's in front of them. So for me, meal planning revolves around a protein option. Every meal, I start with my protein, and then I add a couple sides to it. Usually a starch or a carbohydrate option, like a potato or a rice or a noodle, and then a vegetable option, and then a fruit or a dessert. And so I like to provide the children separate items on their plate for them to kind of pick and choose from. And I think that's fair. If you're going to have a rule in your house where you eat what is served and there are no other options, it's not always fair to just serve a casserole maybe where it's all mixed together, because there may be one ingredient in that casserole that a child really doesn't like, and then you're expecting them to eat that when they don't want to pick through it and pick that out. But if you have all of the items kind of separated on the plate, the children are going to be more likely to still get their protein intake and still get, their fruit or their vegetable, and just maybe leave the starch out or whatever it is they don't like on their plate. So that works well for us. There are, some times where I do make soups and things where it's all mixed together. But even in doing that, I will provide side options. We might have a bread as a side or a salad with the soup. So there's always something they can eat. And then, like I said, no one's going to force them to eat everything on their plate, but I still do want to have something filling their belly and giving them nutrition so that they're not getting up and leaving the table, not having had anything to eat. John, are you going to eat the rest of your egg?
Okay, I don't want to.
Are you going to eat your egg?
I don't want to eat. I don't want to egg.
You ate everything else, buddy, and you licked some of the yolk. Why don't you eat the rest of your egg? You don't want it? Okay, you're all done.
Okay, I don't have it.
You're going to eat his? Another rule in our house is there is no snacking. Our children, we have 6 of them, another one on the way. The children do not have free access to what's in the fridge or in the pantry. Honestly, if we allowed them to have free access and to snack whenever they wanted to, we probably wouldn't be able to keep snacks in the house. That would just be a revolving door of people coming in the kitchen and eating food all day long. And so what works for us is to have set meal schedules. And our meal schedule doesn't vary much at all. Maybe on the weekends things get pushed back a little bit because we sleep in a little more, but for the most part our spacing between our meals is generally always the same. So in a normal day we'll eat breakfast between 7:30 and 8. Lunch is around noon. The kids will have a really light snack after naps, maybe around 3:30, and then dinner is generally around 5:30 or 6. So those meal times are very consistent. The kids' bellies have adapted to being used to that schedule, and there just are no other options to snack in between the meals. And so having that set schedule really serves us well when it comes to pickiness with children and food is the children are very aware. Let's say at breakfast they're eating, that if they don't finish what's on their plate at breakfast, there isn't another option until lunch. So they're going to be going 4 hours without food, and they might get very hungry. So that makes them more likely to eat what's on their plate. There is no 10 o'clock snack option in the house. And same with dinner. We don't do evening snacks before bed. What they eat at dinner is what needs to hold them over until breakfast the next morning. And so they're more likely to eat what's on their plate, knowing that they, don't have other options. So this is a really big one for us, especially as a homesteading family. Part of our reason for moving to this life, to making the choice to grow a lot of our own food, was to teach our children the value of that food and what actually the amount of work that goes into growing and preserving and making the food that goes on their plate. We wanted them to have an appreciation of that and to not be wasteful with the resources that God has provided them with. And so for us, involving the children in all of those processes, in growing the food, in the case of meat, they're even involved in butchering our meat sources. They're involved in baking the food or cooking the food, involved in preserving it for the winter. Being involved in all of those steps gives them some ownership over what is on their plate. And I firmly believe that my kids are really good eaters because they're so involved in that process. When I have a child who has watched a chick hatch and who has helped care for that chick and feed it every day, and then they're even involved in butchering it and maybe even canning the meat, they know how much work and time went into that protein source that's sitting on their plate. they're not going to waste that food. They're not going to let that go into the trash because they know how precious that is. The same with their vegetables. You know, they planted the seeds. They helped me transplant it to the garden. They weeded all around it. They helped harvest it. They did the work in the hot summer days in the kitchen when we're all sweating and we're canning that food. And then winter comes and we pull out the jar and they remember all of that. And if they don't, I remind them of that. Hey, this came from our garden. And it clicks in them like, oh, I should not waste that because we worked so hard for that food. And that's so important. So you might not be someone who lives on a homestead and you might not have the option to raise your own meat and eggs and vegetables or anything, but that doesn't mean that you don't have the option to involve your children in what they are served on their plate. Children can be responsible for helping you prep meals, and they can help cook and they can help bake. They can even be involved in the meal planning process. So when you sit out, maybe you do your meal planning weekly on a weekend night, you plan all your meals for the coming week, have your children sit down with you too and be involved in picking what they want to eat. It gives them some ownership over what is actually served to them. And if they asked for that food, you know, I really wanted to have that soup, they're going to be more likely and also expected to eat it because they're the ones that asked for it. So I hope you found some of these tips helpful. If you're someone who's struggling with a toddler, for example, that you know is really picky and only wants to eat certain foods, you know, think about some of these tips. You know, make sure you're modeling good food behavior in front of them. Involve them in the process of creating what's on their plate. Let them have some ownership over the portion sizes and make sure the portions are realistic. All of these things can serve you well. And remember that toddlers, specifically that young toddler, 2-year-old age, it is very normal for them to start exerting control over what goes into their body. That's a normal developmental stage. And so don't get too frustrated with them during that time. Enforce some of the rules. Try to get them to at least try the food, but you don't have to force feed a 2-year-old to eat things that they don't like. But you are setting sort of the groundwork for how they're going to look at food in the future. So make sure you're talking about the nutrition of what's on their plate and how important it is to get those nutrients. And the final thing I want to say too is, I mentioned this before, that hungry kids will eat. And we have to remember to create that hunger in our children. They're really good, like I said, at listening to their bodies. And so if your child is sitting around staring at screens all day and not being very active, you know, they might not be creating an appetite that makes them want to eat what's on their plate at dinner time. But if you have children that are outside running around, climbing trees, riding bikes, playing sports all day, I guarantee you by the time dinner comes, they're going to be hungry. And even if it isn't a food that they particularly like they don't like Brussels sprouts, but they're hungry enough, they will eat it because they need to fuel their body. They listen to their bodies and know their bodies are hungry. So, you know, get the kids outside, get them active, get them involved in their food, and I think you'll have much better results with getting them to eat. So that's really all of the tips that I have. I hope you found this helpful. I hope you'll like and subscribe. And I look forward to doing more pantry chats with you in the future. Have a great day. Bye.